The boy's boots left no sound on the porch. That was the first thing Eliza Marsh noticed when she stepped down from the wagon. Not the mountains behind the house, not the smell of pine and wood smoke, but the silence of a child who should have been running toward her. He stood in the doorway instead, watching. A boy of maybe 8, in a shirt too big for his shoulders, holding a folded piece of paper against his chest like it might fly away. He didn't say hello. He didn't say anything at all. Eliza glanced at the man who'd brought her here. Samuel Boyle, the driver hired from town, but he only shrugged and unloaded her trunk without a word of his own, as if silence was something this ranch had taught everyone who came near it. "You must be Daniel," Eliza said gently, crouching to meet the boy's eyes. The boy tilted his head, studied her the way people study weather before a storm. Then he turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open behind him. An invitation, or maybe just habit. Eliza stood slowly, brushing dust from her skirt, and looked up at the ranch house for the first time. It was a solid, honest kind of house. Weathered gray wood, a porch that sagged slightly on one end, like it had grown tired of holding itself up alone. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, uncertain line. Beyond the house, the land rolled out gold and endless, cut by a creek that caught the afternoon light like a ribbon someone had dropped and forgotten to pick up. Montana Territory, 1887. A place where the sky felt bigger than anything a person could carry. She had come 300 miles for this. A letter, for lines long, had brought her here. Need a teacher for 2 boys. Room and board provided. Discretion appreciated. T. Calder, Bitterroot Valley. Discretion. She hadn't understood the word choice until now, standing in a yard gone quiet as a held breath. Thomas Calder came around the side of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, and stopped when he saw her. He was younger than she expected. Not old enough for the gray already threading through his beard. Not old enough for the way he carried himself. Like a man bracing against wind that wasn't blowing. "Miss Marsh." He said her name like a question, though he'd written the letter himself. "Mr. Calder." He looked past her, toward the house, and something moved behind his eyes. Worry, maybe, or something closer to grief that hadn't finished deciding what shape to take. "The boys," he said. "They don't," he stopped. Started again. "They haven't spoken. Not since March." Eliza felt the words settle into her chest like stones dropped into still water. "Not at all. Not one word. Not to me. Not to each other, far as I can tell." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Doctor from Helena says there's nothing wrong with their throats. Says it's grief. Says it'll pass." "And has it?" Thomas didn't answer. That was answer enough. "Their mother," Eliza said carefully. "May I ask?" "Fever took her in the winter." His jaw tightened. "I was 3 days out with the cattle when it happened. Didn't make it back in time to." He stopped himself again, the way a man stops himself at the edge of a cliff he's walked toward without meaning to. "I'm sorry," Eliza said, and meant it more than the words could hold. "The school in town won't have them. Boys don't talk. Teacher figures they don't want teaching. So," he gestured toward the house, toward the silence still hanging in the doorway. "I need someone patient. Someone who won't give up on the first quiet day." Eliza thought of her own house, 400 miles east. Empty now. Quiet in a different way. "I don't give up easily," she said. Something in Thomas's shoulders eased, just slightly. Not trust. Not yet. But the beginning of something that might grow into it, given time and weather and the right kind of patience. "There's a younger one too," he said. "Caleb. 6 years old. He'll test you." "Test me how?" But Thomas only picked up her trunk and carried it toward the house, leaving the question to answer itself. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and something baking. Bread, maybe, though burnt slightly at the edges, the way bread bakes in a house where no one quite remembers how their mother used to make it. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, still holding his folded paper. Across from him, a smaller boy, Caleb it had to be, sat with his arms crossed, studying Eliza like she was a fence post that had wandered in uninvited. "This is Miss Marsh," Thomas said. "She's going to be teaching you your letters. And other things." Neither boy responded. Eliza set her bag down slowly, the way she might approach a spooked horse, and pulled out a chair across from them. Not too close, not too far. "I like your kitchen," she said, to no one in particular. "It smells like someone tried very hard." Caleb's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close enough that Eliza filed it away like a coin worth saving. Daniel unfolded his paper, just slightly, just enough to check something, and folded it shut again before she could see. "What's that you've got there?" Eliza asked. Daniel's hand tightened around it. "He draws," Thomas said quietly from the doorway. "Since March. Doesn't talk, but he draws. Leaves them places. Under my boots. In my coffee cup, once." A ghost of something almost fond crossed his face. "Never lets anyone see the finished ones, though." Eliza looked at the boy, at the careful way he held something he'd made with his own hands, something too fragile to trust to the open air, and understood, in that moment, that this house was not simply quiet. It was full of things no one had found the words for yet. That night, after the boys had gone to bed without a sound, not a creak of protest, not a whisper of complaint, just small feet padding up wooden stairs and a door closing soft as a held breath, Eliza sat by the low fire and unpacked the last of her books. Thomas came in from the barn, hat in hand, and hesitated in the doorway the way a man hesitates before entering a room that used to belong to someone else. "They ate," he said. "That's more than they did most nights. Small progress." "Doctor said," he stopped, shook his head. "Never mind what the doctor said." Eliza studied him in the firelight. The tired lines around his eyes. The way his hands, rough from work, still moved carefully, like he was afraid of breaking something that had already been broken once. "May I ask you something, Mr. Calder?" He nodded, wary. "Why discretion? In your letter." Thomas was quiet a long moment. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling softly against the window pane, and somewhere in the dark a horse shifted in its stall. "Because the last two teachers who came out here," he said finally, "left within a week. Told half the valley my sons were broken. Told folks there was something wrong with this house." His voice roughened. "I won't have a third person spreading that kind of talk. Whatever you see here, whatever you hear, or don't hear, it stays inside these walls. That's all I'm asking." "That's fair," Eliza said. "I've kept harder silences than this one." Something flickered across his face. Curiosity, maybe, or the beginning of a question he didn't yet know how to ask. "You said that like you meant it." "I did." He looked at her a moment longer, like a man reading weather in a stranger's face, then nodded once and turned toward the door. "Good night, Miss Marsh." "Good night, Mr. Calder." She found the paper the next morning, tucked beneath her boot on the porch step, exactly where she'd left them the night before to dry. Her breath caught. It was a drawing, rough, a child's hand, but careful in its own way. A woman standing beside a wagon, two boys nearby, and behind them all, faint, almost erased, the outline of another woman, taller, softer at the edges, like a memory rather than a person. Eliza's fingers trembled slightly as she held it. Daniel was watching her from the kitchen window, not smiling, not frowning, just watching, the way a child watches to see if the adults in his life can be trusted with something precious. She folded the drawing carefully, the way he always folded his own, and tucked it into her pocket. "Thank you," she said softly, though she wasn't certain if he could hear her through the glass, or if the words were only for herself. By the second week, small things had begun to shift. Caleb no longer flinched when she entered a room. Daniel left drawings more often now. A horse, a bird, once a careful rendering of the creek behind the house with 3 small figures standing beside it, though Eliza couldn't tell, from the rough lines, whether the third figure was meant to be their mother or herself. She didn't ask. Some questions she was learning needed to be earned before they could be answered. Thomas kept his distance, mostly. Out with the cattle before sunrise, back only for supper, quiet through the meal before retreating to whatever work called him into the dark barn each night. But she noticed things. The way he lingered, sometimes in doorways he didn't need to pass through. The way his eyes moved to his sons at the table, searching their faces for something he was almost afraid to find. Grief, Eliza thought, wore many faces in this house. Silence in the boys, distance in the father, and something else in Thomas Calder that she couldn't yet name. Not quite guilt, not quite fear, but close enough kin to both that it showed in the tightness of his shoulders whenever someone mentioned the month of March. She didn't ask about that either. Not yet. It was raining the evening everything changed. A slow, steady Montana rain that turned the yard to soft mud and drummed gentle rhythms against the roof. Eliza was banking the fire when she heard it. A voice, small, rusty from disuse, coming from the boys' room upstairs. She went still, straining to hear over the rain, her heart lifting with a hope she hadn't let herself feel in weeks. It came again, Caleb's voice. She was almost sure of it, soft and frightened, calling out a single word into the dark. Not Papa, not Mama. A name Eliza had never heard before. A name that made Thomas Calder, who had just come through the front door dripping rain and exhaustion, freeze completely where he stood, his face draining of all its color, as though the boy upstairs had just spoken the one word he had been dreading for 5 long months. Thomas didn't move, didn't breathe, it seemed, for the length of 3 full heartbeats. Then he was moving past Eliza, up the stairs 2 at a time, his boots leaving wet prints on the wood. Eliza followed, more slowly, her pulse loud in her own ears. She found him kneeling by Caleb's bed, the boy sitting upright now, eyes wide and glassy with the particular terror of a nightmare, not yet fully shaken off. Daniel was awake too, in the next bed over, watching his brother and father with an unreadable stillness that made him look older than 8. Caleb. Thomas's voice was hoarse, careful, like he was afraid the word might shatter if he pushed too hard against it. Say it again, son. What did you say? Caleb's mouth trembled. He shook his head, small and frantic, and buried his face against his knees. Thomas sat back on his heels, running a hand down his face, and for a moment he looked less like a rancher and more like a man drowning in a room too small to hold the flood. It's all right, Eliza said softly, stepping into the room. He's all right, Mr. Calder. Nightmares pass. You don't understand. His voice cracked on the words. That name. He stopped himself, looked at his sons, looked at Eliza standing in the doorway with rain still in her hair, and something in his face closed like a door pulled shut against a storm. It's nothing, he said. Old ghost. Nothing you need concern yourself with, Miss Marsh. But his hands were shaking as he pulled the quilt back over Caleb's shoulders, and Eliza saw, in the lamplight, that his eyes had gone bright and wet in a way that had nothing to do with the rain outside. She said nothing more that night, but she did not forget. The name followed her through the following days like a shadow she couldn't quite outrun. She didn't ask Thomas directly. Some instinct told her the door he'd shut would only lock tighter if she pushed. Instead, she watched. She listened. She noticed the way the ranch hands went quiet whenever conversation drifted too near the subject of the boy's mother. She noticed the small, framed photograph that used to sit on the mantel, now turned face down beside a stack of unread letters, as though someone had meant to put it away entirely and lost their nerve halfway through the task. One afternoon, While the boys practiced their letters at the kitchen table, Eliza found herself alone with old Ruth, the woman who came twice a week to help with washing and mending. Ruth was somewhere near 60, with hands like braided rope and eyes that missed very little. "You've been here a fortnight now," Ruth said, not looking up from the shirt she was patching. "Long enough to have questions." "I have several," Eliza admitted. "Ask the ones that matter." Eliza hesitated only a moment. "Who is Rebecca?" Ruth's needle stopped mid-stitch. She set the shirt down slowly, the way a person sets down something that has suddenly grown heavier than expected. "Where'd you hear that name?" "Caleb. In his sleep." Ruth was quiet a long moment, looking toward the window, toward the fields beyond where Thomas's silhouette moved among the cattle, small and distant. "Rebecca was his sister," Ruth said finally. "Thomas's sister. Younger by 6 years. Sweetest girl this valley ever raised. Sang like a meadow lark, could gentle the wildest horse with just her voice." Her mouth tightened. "She married a man from the Eastern Territories. Followed him out past the Dakotas, for years back now." "What happened to her?" Ruth's hands twisted the fabric in her lap. "Nobody rightly knows," she said. "That's the trouble of it. Letters stopped coming a year in. Thomas wrote to the marshal out that way. Got nothing back but silence and one telegram, terse as a slap, saying she'd moved on without forwarding word." Ruth shook her head. "He never believed it. Not for one day. Blamed himself something fierce, too. Said if he'd gone after her sooner, fought harder to bring her home, things might have turned different." Eliza felt something cold settle in her chest. "And the boys? Why would Caleb dream her name?" "Because Rebecca used to sing them to sleep," Ruth said quietly. "Before she left. Same lullaby their own mother sang. Near enough, sisters-in-law, thick as thieves, those two were. When their mother passed this March," Ruth trailed off, letting the silence finish the thought. "He's grieving 2 losses," Eliza whispered. "Not 1. 3 if you count what it did to their father." Ruth picked her needle back up, though her hands weren't quite steady. "Thomas lost his sister to silence and his wife to fever, both before their time, both while he was too far off to help either one. A man carries that kind of weight long enough, it changes the shape of him." Eliza looked out the window again, toward Thomas working alone against the wide gold fields, and understood, with sudden and aching clarity, why the man moved through his own house like a stranger apologizing for taking up space. That evening, she found Daniel sitting alone on the porch steps, his sketchbook open on his knees, watching the sun bleed orange and pink across the western ridgeline. She sat beside him, careful to leave space, and said nothing for a long while. Then, quietly, "Your father told me your mother sang to you. Before." Daniel's pencil stilled. "Ruth told me about your Aunt Rebecca, too. That she used to sing the same song." The boy's shoulders tightened, drawn up toward his ears like a bird bracing against wind. "I'm not asking you to talk," Eliza said gently. "I know words are hard right now. I just wanted you to know that I understand a little better. Why some days are heavier than others." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he turned a page in his sketchbook and held it out to her. It was a drawing of 2 women, standing side by side beneath a large cottonwood tree, their faces soft and smiling, one with dark hair like his own, the other lighter, her arm linked through the first woman's arm like something unbreakable. Beneath the drawing, in careful, uneven letters, the boy had written a single word. "Both." Eliza's throat tightened. "You missed them both." Daniel nodded, once, his chin trembling. "That's all right," she whispered. "That's more than all right. Missing someone means you love them well." For the first time since she'd arrived, the boy leaned, just slightly, into her side. Not quite an embrace, but close enough kin to one that Eliza felt something in her own chest crack open with a tenderness she hadn't expected to feel so soon, so completely, for children who weren't her own. She wrapped an arm around his shoulders and they sat together, watching the sun disappear behind the ridge, saying nothing at all, because for the first time, the silence between them felt like something shared instead of something broken. It was nearly dark when Thomas found them there. He stood at the bottom of the steps for a long moment, watching his son leaned into the schoolteacher's side, and something moved across his face that Eliza couldn't quite read. Grief, perhaps, or gratitude, or some tangled knot of both that he didn't yet have words for either. "Daniel," he said softly, "time for supper, son." The boy rose, gathering his sketchbook, and paused at the top of the steps to look back at Eliza, a small, fragile offering of trust that she tucked away like the drawing still folded in her pocket. When he'd gone inside, Thomas remained a moment longer, looking at Eliza with an expression she was beginning to recognize as something dangerously close to hope. "He hasn't done that," Thomas said quietly, "since before his mother passed. Reach for anyone. Not once." "He's healing," Eliza said, slowly. "But he is." Thomas nodded, throat working, and looked away toward the darkening fields. The same fields where, for years before, he'd stood watching his sister's wagon disappear over the ridge, never once imagining it would be the last time he saw her face. "Miss Marsh," he said, "I owe you an explanation. About the name. About Rebecca." "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Calder." "I think I do." He looked at her then, fully, in a way he hadn't allowed himself since she'd arrived. "Because I have a feeling you're not planning on leaving within the week, like the others did. And a man ought to be honest with the people he intends on keeping around." The words hung in the cooling evening air between them. Simple, unremarkable words that nonetheless carried a weight Eliza felt settle warm and unfamiliar in her chest. "I'm not planning on leaving," she said quietly. "Not for a long while yet." Thomas held her gaze a moment longer than was strictly necessary, something unspoken passing between them in the fading light. Then he nodded, once, and turned toward the house. "Good," he said, so quiet she almost missed it. "That's good, Eliza." It was the first time he'd used her given name. Behind them, from the kitchen window, Caleb watched the two adults linger on the porch steps. And for reasons he could not have explained even if his voice had allowed it, the boy smiled, small and secret, for the first time in 5 long months. Autumn came early that year, painting the cottonwoods gold and setting the whole valley ablaze with color, as if the land itself understood that something in the Calder house had begun, at last, to thaw. Eliza noticed the changes first in small things. Caleb humming under his breath while he fed the chickens. No words yet, just melody, but melody all the same. Daniel leaving his sketchbook open on the table instead of hidden away, as though he no longer needed to guard what he'd made. Thomas lingering longer at supper, his silences softer now, less like walls and more like rooms he was slowly learning to let others into. But the name Rebecca still sat unspoken between them, a door left ajar that no one had yet found the courage to walk through. It was Ruth who forced the matter, in the end, Ruth, with her braided rope hands and her eyes that missed nothing. "There's a letter come for you, Thomas," she said one October morning, setting an envelope on the kitchen table with the particular care of someone handling something that might burn. "Marshall's office. Cheyenne Territory." Thomas went very still. Eliza watched his hands as he opened it, steady at first, then trembling by the second line, his face draining of color the way it had the night Caleb spoke his sister's name into the dark. He read it twice, then sat down heavily, the letter loose in his fingers, and did not speak for a long time. "Thomas," Eliza said softly. "They found her," he whispered. "Rebecca. A homestead outside Laramie. His voice broke entirely. She's alive, Eliza. Alive and asking after us. Her husband kept her from writing all these years. Kept every letter she tried to send. Burned them before they ever reached the post. She only got free of him this summer past. The kitchen seemed to hold its breath. She's alive, Thomas said again, like a man testing whether the words would hold his weight if he leaned on them. Behind him, in the doorway, Daniel stood frozen, sketchbook clutched to his chest. And Eliza saw, in the boy's wide eyes, that he had heard every word. The letter changed everything, and yet changed nothing about the deeper work still waiting to be done. Rebecca would come in the spring, once the passes cleared, alive, but not unbroken, the letter had made clear. For years of silence leave their own kind of scarring, the same way grief does, the same way any wound does when it's forced to close over before it's had the chance to heal properly. Thomas spent that evening out by the barn long after dark, and Eliza found him there eventually, sitting on an overturned bucket with a lantern casting long gold shadows across the hay. "I should be nothing but grateful," he said, before she could speak. "She's alive. God above, she's alive, and here I am sitting in the dark instead of dancing in the kitchen. Relief and grief can live in the same chest," Eliza said, settling onto a bale of hay across from him. "You spent 4 years believing you'd failed her. That kind of belief doesn't undo itself in one afternoon, just because a letter says otherwise." Thomas looked up at her, lantern light catching the wet shine in his eyes. "You always know the right thing to say." "Not always." She smiled, small and honest. "But I've carried my own kind of belief once. I know how heavy it sits." He tilted his head. "You've never told me why you answered an advertisement to come teach 2 silent boys in the middle of Montana territory." Eliza was quiet a moment, turning the question over the way Daniel turned over his drawings before deciding whether to share them. "My husband," she said finally. 3 years passed. Consumption took him slow, over one long winter. We had no children. When he died, the house felt so quiet I couldn't bear to stay in it." She looked toward the dark fields beyond the lantern light. "Your advertisement asked for someone who understood silence. I understood it better than you knew." Thomas absorbed this slowly, something shifting behind his eyes. Not pity, but recognition, the particular kinship of 2 people who had each learned to carry loss without letting it show on the surface. "I'm sorry," he said, "for your loss. And I for yours. Both of them." They sat together in the lantern light a long while, saying nothing more, the silence between them no longer empty but full. Full of understanding, full of the particular comfort that comes from being truly seen by another person who has walked through their own version of the same dark. Winter arrived hard that year, burying the valley in snow deep enough to close the mountain passes for weeks at a time. But inside the Calder house, something had begun to bloom despite the cold. Caleb spoke his first full sentence on a Tuesday in December, so ordinary a moment that Eliza almost missed its significance entirely. "Can I have more bread?" For words, simple as morning, but Thomas dropped his fork at the sound of them, and Daniel looked up from his plate with an expression of such naked hope that Eliza had to look away before her own eyes betrayed her. "Of course you can," Eliza said, keeping her voice as steady and unremarkable as she could manage, though her heart was hammering with a joy too large for the small kitchen to properly hold. Caleb took the bread, ate it, and then, as if testing whether the world would still hold together, added, "It's good." "Ruth's recipe," Eliza said. "I'll tell her you approve." The boy nodded, and went back to his supper as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. As though 6-year-old boys spoke every day, as though 5 months of silence hadn't just cracked open like ice on a spring river. Across the table, Thomas caught Eliza's eye, and in his face she saw an entire winter's worth of grief beginning, at last, to give way to something warmer. Daniel didn't speak that night, but 2 days later, watching his brother chatter happily about a rabbit he'd seen near the creek, The older boy set down his pencil and said, in a voice gone rusty from months of disuse, "I saw it too. By the big rock." 5 words, but they landed in that kitchen like the first thaw of spring, sudden and complete, and impossible to take back once it had begun. Thomas had to leave the table. Eliza found him a few minutes later on the porch, sitting in the cold with his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with something that was neither quite laughter nor quite tears, but held generous portions of both. "He spoke," Thomas said, when he could manage words of his own again. "My boy spoke. He did." Eliza sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "They both did. You didn't give up on them, Thomas. Not once. Not through any of it." "I almost did," he admitted quietly. "Some nights, after their mother passed, I sat right here on these steps and wondered if I was failing them same as I failed Rebecca. Wondered if silence was just what this family did now, generation after generation, same as some families pass down the shape of their nose or the color of their eyes." "You didn't fail anyone," Eliza said. "Grief isn't a debt you failed to pay. It's just the price love leaves behind when it's taken from us too soon." Thomas turned to look at her then, snow beginning to fall soft and silent around them, catching in his dark hair, in his beard, in the lantern lights spilling out from the kitchen window behind them. "I used to think I'd never feel anything but that weight again," he said. "And then you arrived on my porch in a wagon, patient as still water. And somehow you've gone and made this house feel like it might be a home again instead of just a place we're all enduring." Eliza's breath caught. "Thomas, I'm not asking anything of you," he said quickly. "I know it's not been a year even since." He stopped himself, gathered his thoughts. "I only wanted you to know it. Whatever you decide to do with the knowing." Snow gathered on her shoulders, on her lashes, and Eliza found she did not want to move from this porch, from this moment, from this man who had carried so much silence and was only now learning to set some of it down. "I decided some time ago," she said softly, "that I wasn't leaving. I meant it then. I mean it more now." Thomas's hand found hers in the falling snow, careful, questioning, like a man asking permission with his fingers rather than his words. Eliza laced her fingers through his and did not let go. Rebecca arrived in April, when the passes finally cleared and the creek ran high and loud with snowmelt. She was thinner than Thomas remembered and quieter in ways that spoke of her own hard winters, but she smiled, a real smile, unguarded, the moment she saw her nephews running across the yard to meet her wagon, both boys shouting her name at the top of their lungs, voices carrying clear and bright across the whole gold-lit valley. That evening, with Rebecca settled by the fire and the boys finally, exhaustedly asleep upstairs, Thomas stood on the porch with Eliza, watching the last light fade behind the mountains. "A year ago," he said, "I couldn't have imagined this house full of voices again." "Houses have a way of remembering how to hold sound," Eliza said. "Same as people remember how to hold hope." Thomas turned to her, and in the fading amber light, his face held none of the wariness it had carried the day she'd first arrived, only warmth and gratitude, and something steadier than either. "Marry me, Eliza," he said. Simple, unadorned, exactly the kind of honest words this valley had taught him to trust. Not because the boys need a mother, though God knows they've found one in you already, but because I find I can't imagine any version of this life, going forward, that doesn't have you standing right here beside me. Eliza felt the whole wide sky settle warm around her shoulders, felt 3 years of quiet grief finally loosen its grip and drift away like snow melting in a spring ground. "Yes," she said, and the word came out steady and sure, and entirely her own. "Yes, Thomas." They married in June beneath the same cottonwood tree Daniel had once drawn 2 women standing under. And if anyone noticed that his sketchbook, opened later that evening, now held a 3rd woman added carefully beside the first 2, no one said a word about it. Some things needed no explanation at all. That night, long after the small wedding gathering had quieted and the boys had finally, happily, worn themselves out with dancing, Eliza stood on the porch and looked out over the ranch that had become, against every quiet expectation, her home. Two rocking chairs sat side by side against the porch rail, worn smooth with years of use that hadn't yet happened but somehow already felt certain to come. A lantern glowed warm in the kitchen window behind her. And somewhere out past the barn, in the soft blue dark, fresh boot prints ran alongside smaller ones in the mud. A father and his sons, walking home together beneath a wide Montana sky that had finally, after so long, learned how to hold its silence gently instead of heavily.